Mr. President, thank you very much for sitting down with the New York Times today.
Absolutely.
On this really historic moment. Let me begin with sort of the broadest criticism that I see out there, and some of which I've made myself, which is that we had 6 world powers on one side of the table. We had Iran alone on the other side of the table. How come we weren't able to translate that leverage into not just eliminating Iran's ability to be a threshold nuclear power in a decade, but eliminating its nuclear enrichment infrastructure entirely? That seems to be the biggest criticism out there.
Yeah, and I think that criticism is misguided. Let's see exactly what we obtained. We have cut off every pathway for Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. The reason we were able to unify the world community around the most effective sanctions regime we've ever set up, a sanction regime that crippled the Iranian economy and ultimately brought them to the table, was because the world agreed with us that it would be a great danger to the region, to our allies, to the world, if Iran possessed a nuclear weapon. We did not have that kind of global consensus around the notion that Iran can't enjoy any nuclear power whatsoever. And as a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, their argument was we're entitled to have a peaceful nuclear program, and what we were able to do is to say to them, given your past behavior, given our strong suspicion and evidence that you made attempts to weaponize your nuclear program, given the destabilizing activities that you've engaged in the region and support for terrorism, it's not enough for us to trust when you say that you are only creating a peaceful nuclear program. You have to prove it to us. And so this whole system that we've built is not based on trust, it's based on a verifiable mechanism whereby every pathway that they have is shut off. The pathway of enriched uranium, they have to remove 98% of the enriched uranium they have. They have to remove the overwhelming majority of their cascades. And for 10 years, they are under the most severe constraints. And then beyond that, they still have to sign up to an additional protocol that ensures we have the most intrusive inspection regime that's ever been created. They had a facility a heavy water facility that could have created plutonium that was weapons grade. They have to entirely reconfigure that. They had a facility, Fordow, that was underground and so would have been hard to reach. They have to remove effectively the cascades there that could have developed nuclear material. So across the board, what we've been able to do is to assure that Iran will not get a nuclear weapon, and that was always the premise, Tom, of us building this strong international sanctions regime. The notion that the world signed up for these sanctions in order to either achieve regime change, to solve every problem in terms of Iranian behavior, or to say to them in perpetuity they can never have peaceful nuclear power, that was never something that was in the cards.
Pick up something that we talked about last time we discussed this subject. I feel like you have an intuition about Iran from the very beginning that you feel this is a country that was a great civilization historically, that has enormous human capital, and that somehow if we could turn this ship around after it being a source of great instability in this region, it would unlock a lot of different possibilities. In a way, you've tried that with Cuba as well. For 50 years, we were pursuing policies that clearly didn't produce any outcome. But talk about how you see Iran historically and why this agreement might leverage these new possibilities.
Well, I think Iran and Cuba are two different circumstances. Cuba is a very small country, 90 miles off our border, that for a whole series of historical reasons, we had maintained a Cold War posture. They don't pose a significant threat to us or any of our allies in the region. Our main concern there is just to make sure that over time it opens up so that the Cuban people are free. And I think the change in policy is designed to try to accomplish that. With respect to Iran, it is a great civilization, but it also has an authoritarian theocracy in charge that is anti-American, anti-Israeli, anti-Semitic, sponsors terrorism, and there are a whole host of real profound differences that we have between them. And so initially, we have a much more modest goal here, which is to make sure Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. Because if they had a nuclear weapon, that would turbocharge some of the activities that they conducted around the region in a way that would make it more difficult for us to deal with and our allies to deal with. I do believe that there are tensions inside of Iran. What's interesting, if you look at what's happened over the last several months, is the opponents of this deal are the hardliners and those who are most invested in Iran's sponsorship of terrorism, most invested in destabilizing Iran's neighbors, most virulently anti-American and anti-Israeli. And that should tell us something, because those hardliners are invested in a status quo in which Iran is isolated and they are empowered. They become the only game in town. Not just militarily, they call the shots, but economically, they're able to exploit the workarounds from sanctions in order to fatten themselves. In a situation in which you have a different base of business people and commerce inside of Iran, that may change how they think about the costs and benefits of these destabilizing activities. But we're not counting on that. And that's the thing I want to emphasize, Tom, because even over the last several weeks and today, as we announced the deal, what's been striking to me is that increasingly the critics are shifting off the nuclear issue and they're moving into, well, even if the nuclear issue is dealt with, they're still going to be sponsoring terrorism and they're going to get this sanctions relief, and so they're going to have more money to engage in these bad activities. That is a possibility, and we are going to have to systematically guard against that and work with our allies, the Gulf countries, Israel, to stop the work that they are doing outside of the nuclear program. But the central premise here is that if they got a nuclear weapon, that would be different. And on that score, we have achieved our objective.
Prime Minister Netanyahu, you spoke to him this morning. He's called this a historic mistake. Two questions about that. Because what you hear from the Israelis is Obama just doesn't understand evil. These guys are evil, number one. And number two, they deal with the Iranians obviously every day through Hezbollah. So my question is this, really. What did you say to him, and what would you say to the Israeli people? But what are they missing?
Well, what I said to Prime Minister Netanyahu is the same thing that I've said publicly, which is we don't measure our actions against some ideal. It would be great if Iran was suddenly transformed into a liberal democracy that embraced good relations with Israel and the United States and had no interest in any nuclear program whatsoever. That would be my preference. That's not an available option. So what I've said to Prime Minister Netanyahu is this is our best option to make sure that not just for the first 10 years, but for years afterwards, we have a verifiable inspection regime that ensures they do not obtain a nuclear weapon. That is worth an enormous amount in terms of our national security and Israel's national security and our other allies' national security in the region. It also prevents the possibility of a nuclear arms race in the region. Now, what is also true is that by getting this nuclear deal, they have not agreed to suddenly stop some of the activities in the region that's dangerous to us. And we're going to have to continue to press and push against that. But the notion that somehow we'd be better off if we did not have this deal assumes either that we could sustain these sanctions and squeeze them so hard that ultimately they capitulated. There's no evidence and no expert that I've spoken to who thinks that. And in fact, the evidence is the contrary. If this deal did not go through, it was more likely that Iran would obtain a nuclear weapon, which would be a bigger threat to Israel. Or alternatively, that ultimately the only way to solve this problem was militarily, which oftentimes the critics don't want to own because they know that populations inside the United States, for that matter inside of Israel, have real concerns about a military strike. So what I've said to Prime Minister Netanyahu is, number one, this achieves the initial goal on which we all agreed, which was Iran should not get a nuclear weapon. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu would prefer, and many of the critics would prefer, that they don't even have any nuclear capacity. But really what that involves is eliminating the presence of knowledge inside of Iran. Nuclear technology is not that complicated today. And so the notion that the yardstick for success was now whether they ever had the capacity possibly to obtain nuclear weapons. That can't be the yardstick. The question is, do we have the kind of inspection regime and safeguards and international consensus whereby it's not worth it for them to do it? We have accomplished that. What we are going to also have to do, though, is to continue to work with our Israeli friends, Saudis, Emiratis, the Gulf countries, and the world community to make sure that Iran is held accountable for the other activities that we find odious, destabilizing, dangerous. And we still have tools in our toolkit to deal with those. Just because we are removing the nuclear-related sanctions, not only have we obtained an agreement whereby they're still barred under this new resolution from importing ballistic missile technology for 8 years. The arms embargo stays in place for 5 years. But our unilateral sanctions, the U.S. sanctions, remain in place for those activities and those concerns. There are UN provisions that still prohibit Iran from sending weapons to Hezbollah, still prohibit them from sending weapons to the Houthis in Yemen. The question there is enforcement and capacity. And that's why I've been engaging with the Gulf countries and others to figure out how can we put in place better regimes to cut those off. But those tools we have not given away. And the final point, Tom, that I think is the most important thing. Everybody acts as if somehow we gave something up. The United States didn't give up any capacity here. I know the last article you wrote on this, you were quoting somebody who said, well, during the era of the Soviet Union and the United States, there were these negotiations, and Soviet Union was a much stronger country, and yet, in some fashion, the arms control was more balanced. If you think about it, this is entirely balanced in our favor, Tom. We don't give up anything. I'm not relinquishing any military capacity. We're not relinquishing our capacity to impose unilateral sanctions. We have purchased, essentially, over a decade now of international consensus to join us if we feel that Iran is violating any of these agreements. But 10 years from now, 15 years from now, the person sitting in my seat, the President of the United States, Republican or Democrat, is not only going to have the same capacity to take necessary military actions or to impose new sanctions, but is actually going to have more insight in the program and will be better positioned and will have international legitimacy if they have to deal with a violation of the program.
Could you share with us, Mr. President, any specifics that you would say to our Gulf allies or to the Israeli people right now, in light of this agreement? These are the specific upgrades we're going to offer you militarily, and this is the kind of strategy we're going to put in place in order to counterbalance the fact that we will be, although deterring Iran more in nuclear terms, unleashing it more in conventional terms, in terms of the resources it will have available.
Yeah, I don't think it's appropriate, Tom, for me to discuss specific details about security agreements or work that we may be doing. What I can tell you is that that process is in train. Now, with respect to the Israelis, I think it's fair to say that under my administration, we've done more to facilitate Israeli capabilities. And I've also said that I'm prepared to go further than any administration has gone before in terms of providing them additional security assurances from the United States. The thing I want to emphasize is that people's concerns here are legitimate. Hezbollah has tens of thousands of missiles that are pointed towards Israel. They are becoming more sophisticated. The interdiction of those weapon flows has not been as successful as it needs to be. There are legitimate concerns on the part of the Gulf countries about Iran trying to stir up and prompt destabilizing events inside their countries. So they're not just being paranoid. Iran is acting in a unconstructive way, in a dangerous way, in these circumstances. What I've simply said is that we have to keep our eye on the ball here, which is that Iran with a nuclear weapon will do more damage, and we will be in a much worse position to prevent it. And what I've also tried to explain to people, including Prime Minister Netanyahu, is that in the absence of a deal, our ability to sustain these sanctions was not in the cards. Keep in mind, it's not just Iran that paid a price for sanctions. China, Japan, South Korea, India, pretty much any oil importer around the world that had previously import arrangements from Iran found themselves in a situation where this was costing them billions of dollars to sustain these sanctions. In some ways, the United States paid the lowest price for maintenance of sanctions because we didn't do business with Iran in the first place. They made a significant sacrifice. The reason they did was because my administration, our diplomats, and oftentimes me personally, were able to persuade them that the only way to resolve this nuclear problem was to make these sanctions bite. And if they saw us walking away from what technical experts believe is a legitimate mechanism to ensure that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon, if they saw that our diplomatic efforts were not sincere or were trying to encompass not just the nuclear program, but every policy disagreement that we might have with Iran, then frankly, those sanctions would start falling apart very rapidly. And so maybe Iran wouldn't get $150 billion, but they'd get a big chunk of that because we would not be able to sustain that support. And that's not something that I think people are talking about. They talk about this windfall of money that Iran's getting. Well, this is Iran's money that they get from selling oil. And the only reason that they haven't gotten it is because my credibility and my administration's credibility in saying we should stop those flows until this nuclear program is stopped. And that's what we've done.
I want to go back to the Iranian people. If there's one party that hasn't been really heard from in all these negotiations, it is the silent majority there. And they're going to watch this interview. What would you say to them? What are your hopes for them?
What I'd say to them is this offers a historic opportunity. Their economy has been cratering as a consequence of the sanctions. They have the ability now to take some decisive steps to move towards a more constructive relationship with the world community. And what I would say to them is the same thing I said earlier this morning. They need to seize that opportunity. Their leaders need to seize that opportunity. And the truth of the matter is that Iran will be and should be a regional power. They are a big country and a sophisticated country in the region. They don't need to invite the hostility and the opposition of their neighbors by their behavior. It's not necessary for them to be great to denigrate Israel or threaten Israel or engage in Holocaust denial or anti-Semitic activity. Now, that's what I would say to the Iranian people. Whether the Iranian people have sufficient influence to fundamentally shift how their leaders think about these issues, time will tell. But again, I want to make sure that that is not the standard by which we are measuring this deal. We are not measuring this deal by whether it is changing the regime inside of Iran. We're not measuring this deal by whether we are solving every problem that can be traced back to Iran, whether we are eliminating all their nefarious activities around the globe. We are measuring this deal, and that's was the original premise of this conversation, including by Prime Minister Netanyahu. Iran could not get a nuclear weapon. That was always the discussion. And what I'm going to be able to say, and I think we will be able to prove, is that this, by a wide margin, is the most definitive path by which Iran will not get a nuclear weapon, and we will be able to achieve that with the full cooperation of the world community and without having to engage in another war in the Middle East.
So it sounds like Prime Minister Netanyahu would be a lot better off from your point of view, rather than leading the caucus in the Congress against this deal, sitting down with you and really trying to figure out a joint strategy for going forward?
That's precisely the offer that I've made. And I've said that explicitly to him, that I think given his opposition, and in fairness to him, I think there's been widespread opposition to the deal inside of Israel. It may be that it requires this to play itself out. He perhaps thinks he can further influence the congressional debate. And I'm confident we're going to be able to uphold this deal and implement it without Congress preventing that. But after that's done, if that's what he thinks is appropriate, then I will sit down, as we have consistently throughout my administration, and then ask some very practical questions. How do we prevent Hezbollah from acquiring more sophisticated weapons? How do we build on the success of Iron Dome, which the United States worked with Israel to develop and has saved Israeli lives? In the same way that I'm having a conversation with the Gulf countries about how do we have a more effective interdiction policy? How do we build more effective governance structures and military structures in Sunni areas that have essentially become a void that ISIL has filled, or that in some cases Iranian activities can exploit.
Is it time for a peace process between Iran and Saudi Arabia? That is, these two the titans of the Sunni and Shia world. That is, what I hear you saying, Mr. President, I understand we're going to buck up our allies strategically. But do we have a diplomatic initiative? Do we have a necessity of John Kerry going from Geneva to sitting down with Tehran and Riyadh and say, you guys, you got to stop this. You're killing this region and you're killing each other.
Well, first of all, I think John Kerry needs some sleep. That guy's been heroic on one leg, as you are aware. And I want to make sure I give a shout out. Wendy Sherman, our chief negotiator, did incredible work. And she stayed longer in the administration than she had originally planned to finish the job on this. She's been outstanding. Ernie Moniz, our Secretary of Energy, essentially got detailed to this negotiating team, and given that he's an MIT nuclear physicist, was really handy to have in terms of us getting the technical aspects of this right. So they've done a great job. I have long believed that we have to encourage at least a lessening of the hostilities that currently exist between Shia and Sunni factions in the region. Now, I think when I talked to my Gulf allies when we were at Camp David, they'd be very clear in saying that we view ourselves as Arab nations, not Sunni and Shia. And I think they mean that sincerely, and many of them would say that our Shia citizens are full citizens and are treated fairly. But what I think is undeniable is that the sectarian forces that have been unleashed are adding to the viciousness and destructiveness of what's happening in a place like Syria, what's happening in a place like Yemen, what's happening certainly in Iraq. And that our best chance at least reducing the scope of those conflicts is for the Saudis and other Sunni states or Arab states to be at least in a practical conversation with Iran that says the conflict we are fanning right now could engulf us all in flames. Nobody has an interest in seeing ISIL control huge swaths of territory between Damascus and Baghdad. That's not good for Iran. It makes it very difficult for them to sustain a buffer which has always been a significant motivator for them since the Iran war. It's not good for the Saudis. It leaves them vulnerable in all sorts of ways. And the truth of the matter is that most importantly, it's not good for the people there. You watch the news reports preceding the Arab Spring, but certainly since the Arab Spring started to turn into more an Arab winter, and you weep for the children of this region, not just the ones who are being displaced in Syria, not just the ones who are currently suffering from humanitarian situations in Yemen, but just the ordinary Iranian youth or Saudi youth or Kuwaiti youth who is asking themselves, why is it that we don't have the same prospects that some kid in Finland, Singapore, China, Indonesia, the United States? Why aren't we seeing that same possibility, that same sense of hopefulness? And I think that's what the leaders have to really focus on. And I say that, without naivete here, because I think what I have to always guard against in these conversations is the critics will always say, you don't understand the nature of these folks.
You don't understand evil. Obama doesn't get evil.
All this stuff. I had a lot of differences with Ronald Reagan, but where I completely admire him was his recognition that if you were able to verify agreements, that you would negotiate with the evil empire that was hell-bent on our destruction and was a far greater existential threat to us than Iran will ever be. And I had a lot of disagreements with Richard Nixon, but he understood there was the prospect, the possibility that China could take a different path. You test these things, and as long as we are preserving our security capacity, as long as we are not giving away our ability to respond forcefully, militarily, where necessary, to protect our friends and our allies, that's a risk we have to take. It is a practical, common sense position. It's not naive, it's a recognition that if we can in fact resolve some of these differences without resort to force, that's going to be a lot better off for us and for the people of the region.
Let's talk about two specific issues that really come up a lot. One is deterrence. So the Iranians, we suspect, cheat, or we find them cheating somewhere. Did they know right now, Mr. President, if they get caught cheating, they're going to get whacked? They're not going to get another round of negotiations and whatnot. What is their expectation right now?
Well, the nice thing is that as part of the negotiations, we set up what we call a snapback provision. And I know that people are skeptical, well, what is this snapback? It's a pretty straightforward structure. If there is a finding of a violation, then the UN sanctions are reimposed with full force. And this was important. It's not like the Security Council where we've got to get the agreement of Russia or China. If there's one holdout, we can't reimpose it. Under these scenarios, if we establish that there's been a violation, then it is sufficient for us and our European allies to be able to reimpose these sanctions. That's point number one. Point number two, we have established in this document in a very detailed way with the entire verification and inspection regime that we've set up, that if we see a violation, then the international community will find that to be a violation of their activities, and we then have the international moral force to start taking action in a unified way. So we don't have to relitigate this. Iran knows exactly what it's supposed to do. And if they're not doing what they're supposed to do, the world has essentially put itself on record that that will be a violation, and we don't necessarily need to be constrained by what the world says we should do in such an event. But we will at least be on very firm legal footing in saying that we are responding to a direct violation of an agreement that six key powers in the world signed on to.
I guess this goes back to the question is, are the Iranians really afraid of us? This goes back really to the Bush years, okay? Because during the war in Iraq, Iran was caught red-handed, making the shape charges that killed more American soldiers probably than any other device. We really did nothing. We never really called them to account, for that. Why should the Iranians be afraid of us at this stage?
Well, because we could knock out their military with speed and dispatch if we chose to. They understand that. And I think they've seen my willingness to take military action where I thought it was important for U.S. interests. Now, I actually believe that they are interested in trying to operate on parallel levels, to be able to obtain the benefits of international legitimacy, commerce, reduction of sanctions, while still operating through proxies in destructive ways around the region. That's been their pattern. And I think it is very important for us to make sure that we are surfacing what they do through their proxies and calling them into account. That's part of the conversation that we have to have with the Gulf countries. That's part of the conversation that we have to have with the Israelis. In some cases, for example, the Houthis in Yemen, I think Iranian involvement has been initially overstated. When we see our intelligence, we don't get a sense that Iran was strategically thinking, let's march the Houthis into Sana'a. It was more of an indicator of the weakness of the government in Yemen. They now seek to exploit it. Oftentimes they're opportunistic. That's part of the reason why my argument has been to my allies in the region, let's stop giving Iran opportunities for mischief. Strengthen your own societies. Be inclusive. Make sure that your Shia populations don't feel as if they're being left out. Think about economic growth. Make sure that we've got better military capacity for things like interdiction. The more we do those things, that's the level of deterrence that's necessary, because it is highly unlikely that you're going to see Iran launch a direct attack state to state against any of our allies in the region. They know that that would give us the rationale to go in full bore, and as I said, we could knock out most of their military capacity pretty quickly.
Before we close, Mr. President, was Putin a help in the end, a hindrance? And is there something we can build on there? Because it's hard to see how we manage this region, ultimately Syria and the other issues, without Russia.
Russia was a help on this. And I'll be honest with you, I was not sure, given the strong differences that we're having with Russia right now around Ukraine, whether this would sustain itself. Putin and the Russian government compartmentalized on this in a way that surprised me, and we would not have achieved this agreement had it not been for Russia's willingness to stick with us and the other P5+1 members in insisting on a strong deal. I was encouraged by the fact that Mr. Putin called me a couple of weeks ago, initiated the call to talk about Syria. I think they get a sense that the Assad regime is losing grip over greater and greater swaths of territory inside of Syria, and that the prospects for a al-Nusra or ISIL takeover or rout of the Syrian regime is not imminent, but becomes a greater and greater threat by the day. That offers us an opportunity to have a serious conversation with them. One, by the way, that I tried to have 4 years ago when we were at a G20 conference in Los Cabos, in which I said, the problem you have here is that your client, Mr. Assad, has lost legitimacy with the majority of the population in that country, and the more he kills people, the less legitimacy he's going to have, and that's going to empower the violent extremists. So whether we're going to see a huge shift from him or small steps, I do think there's some opening. I think Iran has to worry about the cost that they're paying in terms of keeping the current situation afloat and keeping the ISIL wolf at bay. But we'll have to see whether, in fact, they walk through those doors. Part of our goal here has been to show that diplomacy can work. It doesn't work perfectly. It doesn't give us everything that we want. This is a complicated world. We don't dictate whatever happens. We are the most powerful nation on earth, but we can't control every single event. But what we can do is to shape events in ways where it's more likely that problems get solved rather than less likely. And that's the opportunity we have now. And I know we're running down on time, but one last point I think is important to emphasize in terms of the credibility of the nuclear program inside of Iran. There have been a lot of questions about access to sites and what does this verification inspection regime mean?
And it seems that they could have up to 24 days once we identify something suspicious.
Yeah, so a couple of things. First of all, this is going to be the kind of inspection verification mechanism that has been detailed and codified that we've never seen before. We're going to be seeing their...
For the confirmed sites.
Well, not just the confirmed site, but the entire supply chain, their uranium mines, their centrifuge production facilities, where they make their parts, all the way to the confirmed sites. What that means is that for them to try to set up a covert mechanism becomes really, really difficult. Because we'll be counting how much uranium they're taking out. And if the amount of material that doesn't add up, they've got a problem. If they make a spare part and suddenly we don't see where that centrifuge part might have gone, they've got a problem. So diverting resources to a covert program becomes very, very difficult under this regime. But we also have, in addition to these fixed sites that we're paying attention to, the IAEA has the capacity to, if it has a suspicious site, including a military site like Parchin, to be able to say to the Iranians, we need to get in there. Now, the Iranians may want to negotiate and broker how that happens. But if they refuse ultimately to provide access to that site in a reasonable fashion, then they are potentially in violation of the agreement and sanctions can snap back. And that includes, by the way, things like soil sampling. In the same way, we're going to have mechanisms to...
Because the concern is, I think, that they could scrub the site in that transition period.
But here's where having somebody like Ernie Moniz is pretty helpful, because he assured us that if, in fact, we have good mechanisms to scoop up and sample Earth, this stuff's got a long half-life, right? My high school physics probably isn't equal to Ernie Moniz's, but I do remember it's not that easy to suddenly just hide potentially radioactive material that's been developed. The same is true, by the way, for the possibility that Iran might import materials that could be used for nuclear programs but might have a dual use. We've set up unprecedented mechanisms to be able to look at each one of those imports and say, you got to show us how this is being used to ensure that it's not being converted. So, if you hear a critic say, well, this inspection regime is not 100% foolproof, I guess theoretically, nothing's 100% foolproof. But if the standard is what is the best, most effective, most rigorous mechanism whereby it is very, very, very difficult for Iran to cheat, then this is the mechanism. And it goes far beyond anything that was done, for example, in North Korea, so that when you hear those analogies about, well, there are inspectors there and then suddenly we didn't know what happened, well, a lot of those lessons have been learned by the IAEA and by the world community, and that's part of what we were able to write into this deal.
Just to end, Mr. President, I started as a journalist in 1979, so I've actually known no other relationship with Iran than this one of hostility. you're the president who's now had the most contact with Iran's leadership and negotiating, you and the secretary, of anyone since 1979. What have you learned? What have you learned that the Congress should know? What have you learned that you didn't know? What have you learned that future presidents, might find interesting?
Well, I haven't learned yet to trust the Iranian leadership. Although I think that what John Kerry learned in his interactions with Foreign Minister Zarif, and that then traces back to President Rouhani, is that when you nail down an agreement, they do seem to follow it to the letter, perhaps thinking there may be a loophole here or there, which is why you have to button this stuff down. But the notion that once you put something down on paper, that somehow they're just going to ignore it and try to pocket what they've gained. That's not what we saw during the last 2 years of the interim agreement. There is, I think, restraints that they feel when they have an agreement and they have a document that they need to abide by it. So I think we've learned that. I think that we've also learned that there are different voices and different forces inside of Iran, and that those may not be consistent with our values. The so-called moderate in Iran is not going to be suddenly somebody who we feel reflects universal issues like human rights, but there are better or worse approaches that Iran can take relative to our interests and the interests of our allies, and we should see where we can encourage that better approach. And then I think the last thing that, this is maybe not something I've learned, but has been confirmed, even with your enemies, even with your adversaries, I do think that you have to have the capacity to put yourself occasionally in their shoes. And if you look at Iranian history, the fact is that we had some involvement with overthrowing a democratically elected regime in Iran. We have had in the past supported Saddam Hussein when we know he used chemical weapons in the war between Iran and Iraq. And so as a consequence, they have their own security concerns, their own narrative. It may not be one we agree with. It in no way rationalizes the kinds of sponsorship of terrorism or destabilizing activities that they engage in. But I think that when we are able to see their country and their culture in specific terms, historical terms, as opposed to just applying a broad brush, that's when you have the possibility, at least, of some movement. In the same way that, when Ronald Reagan and others negotiated arms agreements with the Soviet Union, you had to recognize, yes, this is a evil, terrible system, but within it are people with specific historic ideas and memories, and we have to be able to understand those things and potentially try to make some connection. And the same was true with respect to Nixon and Kissinger going to China, which ended up being a very important strategic benefit to the United States.
With 400 people running for president from the Republican Party, is there a chance that that party can in any way embrace this?
I don't think,
given the competition that's been going on.
I think it's doubtful that we get a lot of current Republican elected officials supporting this deal. I think there's a certain party line that has to be towed within their primaries and among many sitting members of Congress, but that's not across the board. It'll be interesting to see what somebody like a Rand Paul has to say about this. But I think that if I were succeeded by a Republican president, and I'll be doing everything I can to prevent that from happening, but if I were, that Republican president will be in a much stronger position than I was when I came into office in terms of constraining Iran's nuclear program. He will be in a position to know that 98% of their nuclear material has been shipped out. He would know that the majority of the centrifuges have been removed. He would know that there's no heavy reactor there. He'd know that the international community had signed on to this. He'd know everything that we've learned from the inspection regime. And he'd still be in possession of the entire arsenal of our armed forces and our diplomatic and intelligence services to deal with the possibility that Iran was cheating. So I think he'd be in a stronger position. They're not going to admit that now, and that's entirely hypothetical because I feel good about having a Democratic successor. But I think that this builds on bipartisan ideas, bipartisan efforts. We could not have succeeded without the strong support of Congress on a bipartisan basis to impose the sanctions we did on Iran. They deserve enormous credit for that. And as we implement this, I think it will prove to be not just good for us, but good for the world.
Mr. President, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks so much.
Good.